for about 8 years. So Health Canada is like basically like the EPA essentially. Yeah, so I worked in the Air Health Science Division at Health Canada as a research scientist for about 8 years. And then I returned to academia in 2016 at McGill, just through an open position that was posted on the website that a colleague had sort of drawn my attention to. So I have a lot of colleagues at McGill that are from the US. So certainly if you're interested in doing a position in Canada, we have a lot of Americans that come to study here and also that work here. And there are certainly institutions have processes in place to help you navigate that system. I think our typical system of sort of moving through the ranks is very similar to what you have in the United States. So you start at assistant, you get tenure, you move to associate, and then you move to full. In terms of language differences, so McGill University is an English institution, and so French isn't required. I don't speak French, but my family does. Certainly, if you're moving here, it definitely helps to speak French. But in terms of my day-to-day work, it's not something that I really need. In terms of the sort of more practical things, one of the things that I think is maybe most different between Canada and the US is that our salaries are actually 100% covered. So we don't have to, like, none of our grant money goes to covering our salaries or usually collaborator salaries. And so it means that our grants are smaller, but the money kind of goes a long way. So, you know, our grants are usually around, say a 5-year grant is usually say around $1 million, but all of that money goes towards, you know, students, research supplies. And so it actually can go quite a long way because we're not using up, you know, 20 or 30% of the grant with just faculty salaries. And I think another consequence of that is because we're not trying to cover our own salaries with research funding, I think there's probably less pressure to feel like you need to be applying for everything all the time. And so I think I definitely see that my colleagues in the US, most of the time, if you go to a conference, what they're talking about is like what grant they're applying for, not necessarily what they actually really want to do. And so I think we have a bit more time to think about what we actually want to do and then write the grant to do that because we don't have that pressure to just always be bringing in things to cover our salaries. Now, having said that, our salaries are lower, I think, but we don't have that pressure to be covering, you know, 50 or 80% of our salary with grants. I think that's probably a big difference, sort of practicality in terms of working in academia in Canada versus the US. For people in environmental epidemiology, the two main funders are CIHR, which is a Canadian Institute for Health Research, which would sort of be like the NIH, I guess, or NIH, yeah, NIH in the US. We don't have like an NIEHS, so it's just sort of one health research funding body. And then I also have funding from it's called NSERC, it's the Natural Resources. Basically, it's like engineering and basic science funding. So I have funding for that to fund my exposure science research. So those would be the two main outlets for funding in Canada. But of course, we're also eligible to apply, say, like the HEI or something if you're working on traffic-related air pollution. Yeah, so I think I'll just stop there. And then if people have specific questions about Canada, I can help.
Thank you, Scott. And then Elaine, let's pass to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me on today. I'm actually from very close to Montreal, but I spent very little time working in Canada. So I did my master's and part of my PhD at UBC in Vancouver, actually. And then I kind of got addicted to traveling and did the rest of my postdoc stuff in Europe. So during my PhD, I had 3 years abroad in Munich, working at the Helmholtz Center. And during that time, I also went to the Karolinska Institute, which is in Stockholm, for about half a year. I've also spent 6 months sort of on a mini sabbatical internship thing, working in Utrecht in the Netherlands at the Institute for Risk Assessment Sciences. This was all sort of as part of my master's and PhD. And then I was very lucky to get a Marie Curie, which is one of the big postdoc fellowships here in Europe. And I went for 2 years to work at IS Global in Barcelona. And I have ultimately ended up in London, UK. And so that was quite a switch from going to Barcelona to London in terms of my sunshine concentration. But I've been at Imperial College now, working at the National Heart and Lung Institute for the last 5 years or so. So it's a bit strange to be sort of like thinking about how to leave the US and or North America in general, because I don't actually have any experience there post PhD. So I can really just tell you about what it's like within Europe. So one of the first questions that we were sort of suggested to talk about was how to effectively search for positions. How is it that I found, all of these places? And you can look on sort of websites and LinkedIn, and ISEE has a job search as well. But I think the most effective way to do that is just to tell people to use your network, sort of dropping names. If you're interested in going to a particular center, Google them, find out who the co-authors are. Do you know any of the co-authors' friends? So when I, decided that I wanted to go do a 2-year postdoc in Barcelona at the IS Global Research Center, I basically told everyone I know that that was my plan, and waited for sort of an opportunity to come up. So I think that using your network, and I know that's like a bit cliche, but it is by far the most effective way I found to be able to get a job. How they differ in terms of, so Scott mentioned that in Canada, it's very similar to the States where you have the assistant, associate, and full professorship. And that is true for some of the countries where I've worked at, but there are some notable differences that, for example, Germany, where some of the universities have decided to follow this model as well, that are slowly transitioning there. But a lot of them still have sort of more traditional model where you need to do something called the habilitation. And what that means is you get an additional degree 5 to 15 years after your PhD. And only then are you sort of like eligible to basically to supervise PhD students or to have any sort of full professorship. So anyone who wants to be sort of a full professor in Germany has to do this like additional sort of like PhD, post PhD. And that is sort of an obstacle. And you'll see that if you Google professors in Germany, they'll have this doctor. And that's what that like first doctor is about. And just thinking about something like the UK, where at Imperial, we actually still use, we don't have assistant, associate, full. We have something that's postdoc, research fellow, lecturer, senior reader, senior reader, and then professor. So you can imagine that there's quite a lot more hoops to jump and promotions to apply for in order to reach that like ultimate stage where you get professorship. So that's just something to be aware of when you're thinking about, do you want to switch country and what are the requirements so that you'd be able to get sort of a tenured position. It was actually interesting to hear Scott talk about how the salaries are basically not as part of your grant, or they're covered by McGill. Because just thinking about the UK, Imperial specifically, that's very much the opposite here. So a lot of the time you're expected to bring in your own salary, and specifically in my institution, it's not written in law or guidelines anywhere, but the assumption is that anyone under associate professorship is bringing in their own salary all the time. So it's very rare to get sort of an open call for an assistant professorship. I know like tons of people who have sort of ERC grants, which is like the big funding mechanism here, who still don't have sort of permanent positions. So I think there's also a lot of variation within a country as well. The last thing I'll touch upon, just so I don't go on a very long rant, is that I found that there's a lot of differences in terms of cultural settings between the universities and the countries where I've worked. And I tend to, for anyone who may know me on the call, I tend to be a bit social. So I do enjoy sort of going for lunch with people. And in Germany, that's very easy. Everyone goes for like a very big lunch. And I'll never forget that in Utrecht, at the Institute for Risk Assessment Sciences, they actually have a doorbell. So at like 12 o'clock, someone goes and ring, or they did have this in 2010, they go and ring this doorbell and everyone congregates at the bottom. And I was able to have lunch with like people like Bert Brunekrief and like very high-end professors who just share a sandwich with you. And that was, I could think, really important and a good development stage. Whereas if you think there are other places that, having lunch isn't that big of an issue. And I don't want to rant out about lunch, but I think it's important to sort of consider the cultural differences that happen between the universities and the countries and how that fits with who you want to be as well. So I'll just leave it there and leave Marcela to talk about her experiences.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Scott, and thank you everybody for being here. I mean, I'm from Mexico, and things in Mexico are very different, and I think in the whole of Latin America. So my plan was to actually go even a step further back, and tell people about like the differences in education, even, because it really is a very different path if you're thinking of an academic career in Mexico, and I think in many Latin American countries, because when you're for starters, like you have only 3 years of high school, so it's 3 years of middle school and then 3 years of high school. In the end, you end up with the same amount of school years, but it changes a bit, like how everybody ends up high school, and then we go on to the university, and you have to decide whether you want to be a medical doctor, an architect. I mean, you have your career there, so for 4 or 5 years, you will study what you think that you want to do for the rest of your life, and by the end of it, it's actually called a licenciatura, a license. So if you study medicine, like you could be a GP, a general practitioner, and just start working immediately, an architect, and start in theory like constructing whatever, designing buildings, like so. And when we think about generally like of going into a master's, or like a postgraduate graduate school, it really means that you're going to academia probably, like you're not maybe going to industry or other things. So it is very different, and in my experience, what I did was, I mean, I come from a very different background. I'm not a scientist. I did my licenciatura, like college, in industrial design. And so when I finished that, I was like, okay, I don't know anything. I mean, I know how to design things, and but I really, what am I gonna do, And so what I did was apply for a job at a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit, and that was interesting. I mean, if anybody has doubts about how to get a job in a nonprofit, I mean, I think that many, at least in Mexico, Latin America, many are funded by uh, foreign funds, So in my case, I was working directly with a program that was financed by the Ford Foundation, and also with this Canada, US, Mexico agreement, And so we had a program there that was what actually brought me to public health, So I came more from like that background, And then by working with a nonprofit for many years, is that I went into a master's in public health. And my experience in public health is more, and in academia, is more in the public branch, So I cannot speak so much for private institutions in Mexico, private universities, but what happens very often, and I think that there's a couple of Mexicans in the call, and maybe they'll agree, is that in Mexico, there's positions in the institutions that are very hard to get. Like you have to wait until somebody retires in order to get a position, for example, at the Mexican Public Health Institute, So you do your master's, and then you might start working with different projects that there are, and you're probably going to be a temporal hire for a while, and that was my case. And then what I did was actually I did my doctoral degree in the US, and I had a Fulbright scholarship. So that's what allowed me to come to the US. And because Fulbrights have a 2-year rule, like I could not stay in the US to work unless I came back to Mexico and spent 2 years in Mexico. So that's what I did. I went back to Mexico. And when I'm not kidding, when I left the US, I had no work in Mexico, So it was a little awkward that like my country would pay also for my education, because I had a grant, also a scholarship from the Mexican Science and Technology Council, but I had no job to go back to, because the institute had no positions. And so what Mexico did is that they installed some positions through kind of like our NIH. And so I went back to one of those positions, but there was actually like maybe no future, like to get a position at the institute. So it's a bit tricky, like for researchers in Mexico. I cannot speak for the whole of Latin America, but I don't know how it would work for a foreign researcher to go and be hired in a Mexican institution like this, a public institution, because there are no positions. So I guess that would really depend on whether you can, talk to like the directors, the people there that would open a position for a foreign researcher, and then, well, I continued doing that. And as Scott described, that is true for Mexico too, that you're on hard money. So you don't really have to worry that much about bringing in research funds, except that in Mexico there's a researcher network that anybody that's a serious researcher should belong to. It's called the ISEE, and so in that network, you get evaluated every year or every other year, so you're on constant evaluation. And then every 5 years, you have a chance to go up in the level of SNE, and they give you a slight financial compensation for being part of that network. And part of being in that network, what they're going to evaluate is how many grants you bring in. So, and then there's like our local NIH that you apply for grants there, and that's how like research is financed in Mexico mostly. Of course, many researchers in Mexico are also establishing collaborations with the US, and so there's a lot of bilateral projects, and that allows also Mexican institutions to get and researchers to get some additional funding. So that was kind of how I was, and until then, I found a job here at Columbia. There was an opening, and then I'll go back to what Elaine said. That it is a lot about networking. And I had been collaborating with researchers from Mount Sinai, from Harvard, from Columbia, since I was working in Mexico, and so when I decided that I wanted to take a next step, like I missed research in the US. I missed when I did my doctoral degree here. I really liked the environment of US institutions, and so when this opening came up at Columbia, I applied for it, and I went through like the whole process that everybody knows here. But yeah, it's completely different. I think that it depends on what university or institution you work for. Like they have different ranks, but the big difference is also that in Mexico you have your salary mostly covered, which makes everything like easier in certain ways.
Thank you so much, Marcela. And then now we're able to open it up for questions. And I see that we have one in the chat from Zoe. And Elaine, I think this question is for you. The question is, I've been told that faculty at European universities won't hire postdocs from an online application unless they know the person and will only hire basically from their network. Has that been your experience?
I would say that hasn't been I'm not gonna lie, having the network and knowing the people and them knowing your name, excellent, especially, and if they don't know your name, they know your supervisor's name, or you can send them a paper or something. But I have also, when I'm thinking of it, sort of when I went to IS Global, it's something I would encourage everyone to do is I basically applied for a job that was advertised that was way outside of my field, like in terms of my experience. And so I was just finishing my PhD and they were hiring, I think, for associate profs at IS Global. And I decided to throw in an application and see what happens. And I didn't get the job. I didn't even get the interview. But they did siphon off basically the candidates that they would like for postdocs. And so you got placed into a little pile of top postdocs in Europe. And so when they opened up postdoc positions, they actually reached out to me saying, would you like to apply for this position as a postdoc? And I knew virtually no one at high school at that time. And so I think it's about knowing your networks, but it's also about putting yourself out there. You know, they're not going to be able to hire you if they don't know that you exist. And that might be through an online application, or also just sort of, like I said, spreading the word that you're looking. Often we get sort of random emails from, you know, people that we know that say, my PhD is graduating. Do you have any postdoc positions? And so it spreads quite well within the network, even if you don't specifically know the person that's hiring. That's a long answer to say no. We also hire people we don't know.
Thank you. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or put them in the chat. And then I see we have another question. But then Elaine, I'm also wondering, could you also speak a little bit about any visa issues you had when going through all these different countries in Europe, considering that you're a Canadian citizen, and whether or not you spoke the language? Just thinking like in Barcelona, they speak Catalan and then they also speak Dutch, and you were working in all these places.
Yeah, I have to say I've been rather lucky visa-wise, because although I'm Canadian, born and raised, I happen to have the French passport. And so since I have a European passport, I've been able to work in all of these countries just as sort of like a regular citizen. And I came to the UK before Brexit, and so I could also just sort of like enter as a regular person. In my experience watching other people go through with it, the visa process is not as bad as in some countries, possibly the US. I don't have any experience there, but there are, you know, clear routes, and most often the universities will support it. If they're willing to hire you as sort of a postdoc, they generally have, you know, processes in place to help you get the visas that you require. So we have people in our group that are from China and Singapore, and we have like very set processes that the university supports. In terms of the language, I found it hasn't been a particular problem work-wise. So the institutions where I work, you know, the ones that are largely involved in the International Society, or ISEE, basically, the working language is English in terms of the outputs, and it's actually been seen as an asset. So being native English, I'm able to sort of help people who may get a manuscript back that says, can you have a native English person read this? You know, help them. Even in Germany, it became such a thing, because I was there for a couple of years, that I ended up opening my own little side company for copy editing, and basically the institution there would pay me to sort of copy edit the manuscripts before they went in. So and I followed that up in Spain as well, and so it was actually kind of seen as an advantage to have native English. And I've missed it a little bit in the UK, where everybody speaks English and no one seems to value the fact that I know that I can spot mistakes easily. So that's work-wise. I think it's sometimes an asset to be a native English speaker in a non-native English speaking country. In terms of the, you know, life, it's complicated, but they have these administrative offices, and if you're patient, you can get through it. You know, usually the universities have very good systems in place to help the international researchers if it's sort of like a bigger institution.
Thank you. Okay, next question is coming from the chat, and this seems like it's directed for all of you. And this question says, in some American universities in the environmental health sciences department, there is a fair amount of collaborations and crosstalk between environmental epidemiology and environmental toxicology researchers. Could you comment on whether these exist or have existed at the non-US institutions you've been at?
I can start. So at McGill, we definitely over the past, say, 10 years, have made an effort to have more interactions between the epi and the tox side. So we developed a class that's co-taught by toxicologists and epidemiologists, where we have students from both toxicology and epidemiology kind of working together. So I think that that's something that certainly exists here, and that you could, if you moved here and were working here, you could probably easily, you know, get collaborations going with toxicologists interested in environmental stuff.
Thank you. And did anyone else have anything to add to that?
I mean, I can say that in Mexico, I mean, at the Public Health Institute, there is actually a lot of collaboration with a toxicology school called Sinvestav. And so we have actually a lot of professors that are teaching, because of what I described actually, of the system, of the network, part of something that is very well seen, and that's kind of like you check a box in your evaluations, is that you can also teach in other institutions, that they're asking you to lecture in other Mexican institutions. So that there is a lot of collaboration, I would say, and also in research funds. There's usually, like our local NIH, CONACYT, has been doing, I mean, I think now it's actually disappeared in the last, with oh, something that I think is interesting also to say, that is very frequent in Mexico, and I think in many Latin American countries, is that with every change of government, everything changes, you know? So I mean, I know that it's happening now here, but in Mexico, it's like it's 6 years, and every 6 years, like, you can expect that there will be a lot of changes in what regards to, you know, the budget that is assigned to science and education. So, but anyway, I diverted a little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of collaboration between environmental and epidemiologists and toxicologists.
Okay, this next, oh, sorry, Elaine, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just gonna agree.
Okay, sorry. Okay, this next question is about grants. And then, Rashad, we'll go to you after this one. And the question is, what are the regulations around Canadian researchers / institutions applying to NIH grants and bringing those with them to Canada, and then similarly to Mexico?
So I've applied to NIH grants before. I've received funding from an NIH funded center before, so there's no limitations there. And I don't think there's any issue with bringing it to Canada either, because I know one of my colleagues had an EPA STAR grant or something, and I think she brought that from wherever she was in the US to McGill. I think that if there's any regulations, they probably wouldn't be on the McGill side. They would be on the NIH side in terms of what they allow you to do with the money. But McGill would be more than happy to take the money, I'm sure. So,
Yeah, and then it's asking for Mexican institutions. And I mean, of course, if you bring money to a Mexican institution, they're very, very happy to receive it. But I'm not sure about like what the NIH regulations would be for that, right? Because normally, I mean, in my experience now, what the contact PI is generally in a US-based institution, unless there's a specific call for it being otherwise, you know? And so I'm not entirely sure that the main researcher, I mean, you can have a subcontract, definitely. Like there's a lot of US Mexico grants, like the Progress cohort, the Element cohorts, you know, that have been ongoing for over 25 years, and they're mostly NIHS funded, you know, but the contact PI is in the US, and then they cut a subcontract for the Mexican institution, you know. I don't know that NIH would fund something that where the funds are completely in Mexico. I don't have any experience with that, but it could be. I don't know.
Thank you. Rashad, did you still have a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you for organizing this. I am an early career researcher based in the US, originally from India. I have a question regarding prioritizing personal factors when you make decisions regarding moving countries for jobs. If you have some experiences from your own move or people that you know who have prioritized personal factors such as your partner's career or children's education, are they moving schools? How to sort of like navigate that front?
do you want me to start? Or
Sure, sounds good.
okay, yeah, so that's super important. I think the personal side of things. I mean, I think picking a city that you want to live in is super important, and that lines up with the sort of values that you have. I know that there is it all depends on what like your spousal does for a job, but I know that there are efforts if we're bringing someone in to help their spouse, you know, find a position. for Montreal specifically as a city, it's a great place to live. It's safe, it's multicultural, it's very diverse and accepting of differences. I mean, Canada's a great place to live. There's lots of nice cities, but I wouldn't want to live anywhere else in Canada. It's not perfect. There is always sort of government ups and downs in terms of sort of language politics and things that have impacts on McGill, because it tends to be kind of singled out as an English institution. Sometimes is harmed by some governments in terms of the language stuff, but all in all, it's a great place to live. I have two kids, 12 and 9, that I think, yeah, I mean, it's great to see them grow up and be able to switch languages effortlessly. And yeah, and I think certainly any job wherever you go, getting started in your career, it's just hard, right? Like you have to work hard and it takes a lot to get it going. But I think that like quality of life, once you get established is pretty great. And I think that overall, I think that sort of academics in Canada don't have the same amount of stress and pressure that the US do, because of the sort of pressure to always be raising your own salary. I don't know if I would be as effective as a researcher if I had to always be worried about that. I think that would just weigh on me personally. So yeah, but I think picking a city where you want to live is really important. It's not just work. So.
Do you want to go, Elaine?
Sure, I'll jump in here. I can only echo Scott's comment. A lot of the moving that we did was during the PhD years, but obviously when you do your postdoc or assistant prof, there's a lot more to consider. And I found that compromise, as cliche as that is the only way forward. So when I went to IS Global, that was sort of a choice that we made, that we would prioritize this fellowship that I got. And then it was my husband's turn to choose, and he's in finance, so he picked London. And I have to say, I came here kicking and screaming, but it was his choice and it was his turn. And London has won me over. It's a great place to live, but there is definitely a lot of compromise. And since then, we've got 3 kids, and so thinking forward about, do we want to stay in London or do we want to go to a smaller city? These are choices that have to be made, and I would really sort of think about not just if you want to be an academic or not, but which institution has the policies and sort of the support that would make you happy. There's something about working at sort of a top institution like Imperial. It's great, you walk the halls with giants, but there is a lot of pressure. And sometimes you sit back and wonder, like, if I went somewhere a little bit smaller, there'd be less pressure, where your salary is guaranteed and stuff. So I think it's all about balance. It's where you want to live. And in my case, is like, I will never move somewhere where there isn't a big airport, because my family's in Canada and my partner's family is somewhere else. And so we will live someplace that's a big airport. And that might be bad when I say that in an environmental health webinar, but it's sort of reality for us. So I think that we're making it work, but it is, up there with job is life. And that's just the plain and simple of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I can add my experience, and it's like, I mean, I started my family when I was in my doctoral studies, and everybody thought that it was like insane, but I had 2 kids while I was doing and it was the best time I could have done it, because you're not so pressured, right? I also think that taking your time and working, like I mentioned that after the master's, I worked for a while. I think it opens your experience a lot, like not to, I mean, it's okay if you want to go like move ahead like straight, but I don't think that you're wasting your time if you try different institutions, like try different things until you know what's right for you, I mean, my last decision to come, I mean, after the doctoral degree, I mean, I forgot to say, of course, that the Fulbright had the 2-year rule, but I had 2 babies, and I mean, I had grandparents, aunts, friends, everybody in Mexico that was just waiting for us, like, with arms open to help us out. And so having that extra help, especially when your kids are younger, is fantastic. And then the kids grow. right? And so in my case, like I have two daughters, and one just turned 15 and one is 12. And for me, yes, there was a lot of personal reasons to look for a job uh, in the US or elsewhere. My husband is not Mexican, he's Serbian. And so we had also committed to, similar to Elaine, like we would try living outside of Mexico after a period of time. So when this opportunity came up, we were both very, very excited, and our daughters were just ready to be more independent and live in a more diverse place. And there's a direct flight from New York to Belgrade. And I think that it does count, like you have to consider those things. And then I just want to mention one thing, and for American citizens, and like I've mentioned this a couple of times, but the Fulbright scholarships are great, and they have you can apply for these to spend 1 year in Mexico, for example, and I don't know if the program is open for you to do like some time away, like being working as a scholar in other places in the world. But I would definitely explore that. I mean, if you don't want to commit to like a whole finding another position, like you can contact somebody that does something you like in another country and then get a scholarship that allows you to be there for a year or two. That's also very an interesting way to experience another country.
Thank you all so much. I agree with everything that you said, that the personal choice is definitely up there with where to try to find a job. I have a question that I know that all of you are academics, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about possible areas or like other types of institutions that might do public health work in some of the countries that you've worked in that are not necessarily universities. Like I'm thinking here, like state health departments and things like that will hire a lot of like public health grads, and I'm wondering like what do those look like in other in other countries?
Yeah, so I worked for Health Canada for almost 10 years. I think it's a bit trickier, I think, to get hired for provincial and federal agencies if you're not Canadian. It's not impossible, but I think there is a sort of priority put on hiring Canadian citizens for those positions. But I think generally it's not a bad idea to cold call people. Right? Just like if you want to move to British Columbia, you could, there's nothing, send the BC CDC, an email and say, hey, I'm an expert in this area. I'm looking for positions. Like in my experience, there's like, if someone wants to hire you, there's always a way they can figure it out. It just might not be like on a website somewhere clearly outlined, but like there, if someone wants to make it happen, they can make it happen usually. It's just, you have to be a bit persistent and like put yourself out there, like we were saying before. So it's not impossible. It's probably just not as easy as a job at a university where it's sort of set up to bring in people from all over the place.
Yeah, I can go next on this one. I think this is where the language matters. So in the UK, there's obviously English and lots of sort of postdocs and friends and assistant profs have gone on, and you can work for Public Health England, which is, I'm assuming, the governmental agency. There are some restrictions, like you can't work for sort of our equivalent of the CIA or like forensic science. So the really crime stuff, they have some sort of restriction on your passport. But in general, in the UK, you can do that. But when you think of sort of the other countries where I've worked at, you need the local language. So you wouldn't be able to work. I wouldn't be able to work for like the German public health, just because the communication there is going. Unless my German is perfect, which it's sadly not. It's good, but it's not at the point where I can like communicate at that political level or at the governmental level. So that's something to keep in mind if you're choosing a country where English is, or whatever language is there, is not your native language. Then you're probably going to be semi-restricted to an environment where English is the working in language, such as a university or a major research institution.
And I think I would like to contribute with like the nonprofit world, like that's also a pretty cool world to work at, and I think there's many nonprofits out there that do very interesting work, like in environmental health also. Once I had a job as a marketing coordinator for Aid to Artisans, and they had a program in Mexico in Pátzcuaro, and I know that the director of the program, they hired a Canadian actually to lead the program, and he did a great job. And I mean, he did speak Spanish. I think that is true, that you're more likely to need to speak Spanish. But I think that, I mean, that's also part of the adventure, right? Like if you look for a job like that and you don't know the language, you're going to pick it up fairly. I mean, there's some languages that are easier, of course, but if there's any, curiosity to learn another language, I would say that that's also a great way to not only learn the language, but also experience the culture, and nonprofits are way more relaxed. Usually they're more relaxed, and if they have a program that is financed and there's positions open, like it's a very rewarding experience also, so I'm thinking about, for example, Pure Earth. Like they also have a lot of programs around the world with that do environmental health, and so I'm frequently looking for they have open positions, so that's another route.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I had one other question, then unless anyone has anything to put in the chat, then I think we can end after this one. But I'm noticing on the call that I recognize at least a few names of people that I know are PhD students who are interested in potentially searching for international postdocs. So I was wondering if you all could speak to any specific skills in addition to networking that might be helpful for searching for international postdoc positions. Like, for example, here, I know that like publications are really valuable. Are things like that still the ones that like the typical things that would be valued, or is there any like specific things that you could recommend?
Sorry, can you maybe just reframe the question a little bit? Sorry.
Yeah, so I just mean like for like here, like a lot of things that like we tell PhD students are like publications are really valuable. Like that's something that like people will look at when you're going to look postdocs. Like what are other, like, is that something that would be similar in other countries, or are there other things that like if you as a faculty member in Canada would like look for when you're looking at a CV for someone that might be applying for a postdoc in your group?
Honestly, what I do now mostly is base it on like, do I want to spend time with this person? I mean, because everyone's smart, right? I mean, at that point, the CVs are all pretty good. I mean, obviously you want them to have expertise in whatever project they'll be working on, but I base it a lot now on like interpersonal stuff, right? Just so like, I'll have set up Zoom calls and just have a quick chat and just see if it seems like this will be a good, working relationship. So I mean, I don't think that there's any difference there in terms of how Canadians researchers would be looking at recruiting postdocs than American postdocs. And again, I think just reaching out to people that you want to work with is a good idea, because like, especially with COVID in the past couple of years, maybe you weren't able to attend conferences or something, and so you didn't have those opportunities to like just meet people. So I think just reaching out is a good idea.
Yeah, I guess maybe to echo what Scott said, that at some point the CVs are similar, right? They will have completed a PhD. There presumably will be 1 or 2, 3 publications. And so if you can do anything that's like extra than that, like did you do a public outreach activity? Are you part of society where you like, are part of the SNRN at ISEE? Is there something that sort of like sets you apart? I don't even have an idea of like what that thing is, just is that thing there? Or that kind of like sets you apart. I did want to, it's like on that note, also having an idea of like the funding that you could apply for. So it's always nice to get a postdoc to come and fill the project that you're hiring for. But if that postdoc also has an idea of like, I'd like to start in your group for a year, but I'd really like to apply, for example, anyone coming to Europe, they can apply for the 2-year Marie Curie fellowship, which is open to sort of any nationality that's coming to a European institution. So having an idea that like, I'm going to start in your group, but I'd like to apply for this fellowship because it would be blah, blah, blah. Having that plan and that you've thought about what this might look like is encouraging, even on a Zoom call.
Yeah, and I would say just don't be shy. I mean, don't be shy. Like, we're all human. Like, no, and I mean, also, like, if you want to reach out to somebody that you would like to work with and they don't reply, or they, I mean, or you actually get in the Zoom call with them and they're not, I mean, you don't like them. I mean, I mean, it goes both ways, you know? So, I mean, just thinking that you're going to have to work with that person for a long time, no matter what the time is, I think that that's really important. You should not be unhappy in your work. I think that that's like very, very important, because you probably will be more creative, and you will be better off if you're happy. And
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Marcela. Even in terms of not even finding a job, but when you're starting up a new collaboration, if it's
oh
like
my God,
super
yeah.
hard to like get this person on a call, they don't answer your emails, you're like, this is probably not going to work out. And sort of looking at that as a, you know, if I want to work with this person and they don't seem to have any time to answer my email, then it's, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and life happens, right? I mean, it might be also that you're catching somebody in a really bad time, you know? So, I mean, be open and just, I don't know. I think that sometimes like asking direct questions, you know, like, is this a good time? You know, like, I mean, it's just very normal, you know, like we're all humans.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, last question. This one is from Neha, and she said, I may have missed this, but could you all briefly talk about how the weight or the ratio of lectureship / teaching and research responsibilities might differ from US institutions, acknowledging that this is likely very different depending on the institution and your role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my department, the sort of baseline teaching is 2 classes a year. So I do one class in the fall, 1 class in the winter. But if you get a Canada Research Chair, which is like a fancy salary award that you can apply for, then that basically buys you out of 1 class. So you just teach 1 class then, and the rest of the time is research and a little bit of service to keep the department running. But that's the sort of expectation for us.
Yeah, I think from my side, it differs a lot based on the different institutions. So in Germany and in the Netherlands, I worked for institutions that weren't necessarily universities. We didn't offer like a PhD program or a master's program. I don't know if it would be the equivalent of the CDC, but it was more like a research institution than sort of a university or college. And so there's no teaching expected. And they actually are leave you alone if you don't speak the native language. So that worked out. Whereas as Imperial College now, it depends on your funding, as Scott mentioned. And so the grant that I'm on now is my grant. I brought it in, and so there's actually no expectation for teaching because I'm fully covered. I do teaching, but it's nice that you get to be selective about, you know, teaching probably like a week-long course rather than like 1 hour every week for forever. But if your grant is partially, or if your salary is partially covered based on the department, then you're going to be expected to do teaching. The one thing that's nice about, I think it's coming out of few universities in the UK, it's definitely an Imperial, is that we're sort of acknowledging teaching as being more important than this task. So some people really like teaching. And so they've established you can be sort of a research fellow, which is a route that is what you would consider sort of the classic academic route. But you can also, as a postdoc or slightly above, decide to become a teaching fellow, which means that you do very, much less research, but you actually focus on how to teach students well, develop blending learning. And a lot of this came out right before COVID and has been amplified with the hybrid approaches. And it's about like, how do we teach people better at Imperial rather than just, making people teach. And so you can, develop expertise and even research how to teach well. Following this teaching route that's just exploded and taken off. Like people are loving it here. So that's something that's I think is I haven't seen it anywhere else, is this actual like kind of valuing how to teach better.
Yeah, and I will just say that in Mexico, at the National Institute of Public Health, I mean, everywhere where there's programs, graduate programs, I mean, you're expected to teach. You know, and then, I mean, my last position before coming here was at the Mexican Social Security Institute, and that's mostly a healthcare provider. So I mean, there's no school there, you know. However, I was involved more in like the training of the medical residents, you know, and so they would invite me to give some seminars once in a while, you know, but it really depends on again, on the institution and whether they're a teaching institution or not, I think.
Thank you all so much. And I think with that, let's close here and thank you all so much for your time. And it was great to hear more about your different experiences working at all different parts of the world. Yeah, I think this was really helpful for many of our attendees. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.